Welcome, everyone. My name is Maisy Card. I'm a novelist, and I'll be moderating tonight's conversation with Danielle Geller, Jamie Figueroa, and Linda Rui Feng. We're broadcasting on Crowdcast, and we want you to be part of the conversation. The chat is open for your comments. PEN America staff will also be answering questions in the chat throughout the event and sharing information about the participants. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The event will be live captioned. Please see links in the chat for access, and we will provide periodic visual description for low vision folks in our audience. Right now, we are in a frame on the left side of the screen. We see branding for PEN America and the PEN World Voices Festival in the corners, and there's a chat with lots of comments on the side where people are telling us where they're watching from. So let's get started with the event. Tonight, Danielle Geller, Jamie Figueroa, and Linda Rui Feng will be in conversation about their debut stories that each entangle readers in family histories that reveal many rifts and contradictions and offer original perspectives on loss, inheritance, and the social context that often catalyze or seep into grief. Danielle Geller's memoir, Dog Flowers, presents herself and her mother on a parallel journey toward redemption as two Navajo women healing from the scourges of poverty and alcoholism. Also set in the wake of a mother's passing, Jamie Figueroa's novel, Brother, Sister, Mother Explorer, follows a surviving daughter as she gambles to convince her brother that life is worth living despite the indignities they have inherited. Linda Rui Feng's novel, Swimming to Trout River, chronicles the immigrant experiences of a married couple as they reckon with violent memories of China's Cultural Revolution and make moves to reunite with the daughter they left behind and start anew. I will now introduce the authors and ask them to share their pronouns and a brief visual description of themselves. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a Black woman with dark brown skin. My straightened black hair is cut into a bob, and I have red lipstick on. I'm wearing a floral print shirt, and behind me is a tan-colored wall and a floating bookshelf to the right of my head and another bookshelf to the left. So first, how about Danielle, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Danielle Geller. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a cisgender Indigenous woman with long dark hair. I wear glasses and I have a septum piercing, and I'm wearing a hoodie over a pink blouse. And behind me is a loom, and a bookshelf.
Hi, my name is Jamie Figueroa. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a cisgender mixed race woman of Puerto Rican descent with brown skin, mid-length, wavy, dark hair. And I'm wearing an orange button-down shirt. And behind me are bookshelves, vertical bookshelves, a floral hanging, and a gray chair.
Thank you. And Linda?
Hi, my name's Linda, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a cisgender Asian woman, and I have long pandemic hair. And behind me is mostly a wall, but to my left are kind of bookshelves and shadow. So here we go.
Okay, great. So we can get started with the discussion. The first thing I wanted you guys to do is just kind of introduce your books, kind of give a brief kind of summary, and then also talk about when you began writing, and also if the book kind of evolved, when you began writing, you initially knew you were working on a full-length book. So anybody can start.
Yeah, I can start. So I started writing my book Dog Flowers in 2014, about like 6 months after my mother passed away. And when I first started writing it, I was writing it in letters to my sister that I was sending to her when she was doing some time back where we lived in Pennsylvania. And so I didn't really know that it was a book when I first started it. I was just trying to conjure up all a bunch of memories from childhood, but also she wasn't able to be there with her mom when she was in the hospital before she passed. And so I was also trying to write about that time for my sister, because we were sort of in this limbo period of not really having gone through that process of grieving her together.
Okay. Jamie?
My apologies. Let me start over again as I was muted. So I began this work in 2015 at the end of my MFA. I had a really fantastic mentor who told us all to begin something before we graduated. And so I had about 20 pages of something that felt very electrifying and that I was very magnetized to. And I just kept writing into it, and it very much took me and all of my life and all of my attention. It demanded that, and I'm grateful for the active presence of it. And I could just say that it's very much this brother and sister in their late 20s who have just lost their mother and who have this weekend together to also try to find their way into surviving what might come next for them, and also are flooded with traumatic memories of their life as young ones in a family. So very much about ancestral trauma and generational trauma, and a lot of blanks, and how do we navigate blanks. And so that's something that I could really identify with and feel familiar with from my own experience growing up. But other than that, it very much is a work of fiction. I would say it has a lot of emotional autobiography, but as far as its details and relevancy, it very much was its own thing and informing me all along the way. So I did my best to honor it and give it as much attention and dignity as I could.
Thanks. Linda?
So I started this, what would be a novel, in I just say 2009, when I actually started my job as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And at the time, I really didn't know what shape this story would take. I started with hearing voices that needed to be put into stories. And I started with maybe 2 or 3 points of view that I wanted to incorporate into. I was thinking maybe a set of linked stories. And I had no plan. I had no strategy whatsoever. And I just, and of course it took a long time for things to kind of come together. But I knew from the beginning that this would be a multi-voice, a multi-generation story, and that it would have to deal with a lot of the messiness of moving across time and continents. And I knew that it would be kind of a jumble that I would have to sort through. And fortunately, I was able to kind of, with the help of other people and good writers and books that are available too, I was able to sort them out a little one step at a time into this book. And for me, it's a story that thinks about not just immigration, but emigration, which is the opposite side of the coin of coming into a country, which is to say leaving one's native country. And I very much want to see both sides of that journey. So.
Okay, great. I also wanted to talk about some craft choices everyone made in their novels. And I wanted to introduce the next question by having Danielle read an excerpt from her book.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. My mother lived entire lives apart from mine. I am tempted to erase the questions and unknowns from my mother's life, to simplify the arrangement, but what kind of archivist would I be? By the end of the night, I arranged my mother's papers and photographs into a series of labeled manila folders: diaries, work, medical, correspondence, and photographs. I arranged my mother's diaries, which she kept in appointment books by date. The oldest diary is from 1987, the year after I was born. It is different from the others, which are cheaper and spiral bound. The hardcover is puffy with gilded trim, and it is titled Adventure, The Art of Living Dangerously. In the pages between each month, the editor, Richard Frisby, curates stories and illustrations of world-traveling adventures like Teddy Roosevelt, Kilton Stewart, and Naomi Umara. There is no indication my mother read the stories. The pages are crisp, absent underlining or other marginalia, but they provide a charming, if not simple, frame. Every day used to be an adventure in staying alive, Frisby writes in his introduction to the book. Although circumstances have changed over the past few thousand years, we still have the reflexes of a species used to living on the edge of danger. Frisby writes about men and women trying to survive extremes of weather and circumstance. They battle ice and snow, shark and bear and crocodile. In 1987, my mother describes finding me crying in my crib, my father drunk at a friend's. She describes a conversation with my grandmother in which my mother agrees to quit her job to take care of me. She writes about my father's struggle to find and keep a job. She tallies the weeks and months of his sobriety. On April 2nd, she records 3 months and 2 weeks, and then nothing. The tally ends. On July 27, 1987, she quotes my dad, or she says he got mad and wanted to fight the world. I turn the pages slowly, read most but not all of the entries aloud. I trace my fingers over my mother's careful cursive, over the destruction that unfolds. On August 19, 1987, in red ink, she writes, I started drinking about noon that day, and by 4:30 and 5 p.m., I was well on my way to a blackout. We went to a Chinese restaurant, and I sure started a fight with Mike, and it got worse by the time we got home. I said things that I haven't said to Evelyn and also don't really remember, but anyway, was up at 10:30 and sure felt terrible, but also knew it was my fault, but also that Mike should have not hit me. I realized I've forgotten that my friend is here, a silent spectator to time before memory. I close the book and rub the pad of my finger against its hard edge, as I would my childhood blanket. It makes me feel sorry for her, I say. My friend nods, her silence an invitation to talk. But it's late, the window's dark. I'm tired, I say, instead, sliding the diary between the neatly labeled folders inside the box. The diary's dimensions are too large for its own folder. I press the lid down, over the top. When a person dies, the chi'idi is the thing left behind like a ghost. The chi'idi carries the residue of every wrong thing the person was unable to bring into balance or harmony in life. The chi'idi haunts a deceased person's bones and possessions, exits the body with their last breath. Contact with the chi'idi can cause illness, a ghost sickness, which manifests physically and mentally through symptoms you might recognize as grief. I am not trying to learn how to grieve my mother. I have been grieving her absence my entire life. I am ghost sick, possessed.
Thank you. So I was so excited when I saw you were trained as an archivist, because I am too. Yeah, when I got an MLS after my MFA, and so I love the arrangement of the book, how the photographs and all the kind of ephemera from your mother is labeled with archival description. And also that there's this kind of like parallel narrative at the bottom where we see footnotes from your mother's diary, kind of responding to the events you're experiencing. So my question is just, how did, thinking like an archivist help you write this book? And my question for Linda and Jamie is, how do you make the connection between writing and archiving in your work? What does your work seek to preserve, and what do you try to excavate in your work?
Yeah, well, I guess I can open up and say, when I first started writing, I was finishing up my time in grad school, so I was still immersed in all like the theory and all the big ideas about what archiving means, and also doing a lot of unpaid internships and doing a lot of that grunt work of just going through endless boxes and like trying to make sense of it. So that process of archiving at the beginning, I think, helped me find some emotional distance when I needed it. And then it turned into almost, I had to deconstruct that way of thinking, which felt very tied to a more colonial way of thinking, and had to ask those questions of, am I creating an archive? And if I'm creating an archive, who am I creating it for? Is this for family? Is this for, I'm not planning to have children. Is it for my sister's children? And why do I think that this needs to be saved? Because it goes very much against the idea in Diné culture, like my mother's own desires or beliefs that those things would be destroyed, that those things wouldn't be talked about. And so it was a tension and questions I had to ask myself all along the way.
Jamie or Linda?
Well, I guess I'll go next. Thinking about writing and archiving. So I'm not trained as an archivist, but I think about history a lot in my professional life as a faculty. But I also, for a good deal of, I would say, the first 18 years of my life, I wrote a lot of letters. Physical letters with stamps on them, and one of my most enjoyable pastimes is actually to just go through the letters that had traveled across the ocean from my extended family, and even in some cases, just friends who are at some point just living in the same city as me. We wrote letters, and so I developed an interest in thinking about how letters can really, the epistolary narrative could do a lot in telling story and thinking about a kind of a dialogue that's really unique on the page. And so I incorporated some of that into my novel with these letters that the protagonists write to each other, between the married couple, and then also between Momo, who wrote to the violinist that he saw on TV. And so that's my angle into the archivist writing continuum, and a really fruitful relationship, I think.
I would have to say I have a very different answer to this because I'm coming from a very different place. I admire the way in which you all have sort of organized thought and material in relationship with keeping record and that correspondence to history. I think about, you asked the question, seeking to preserve, and I think about the relationship with the unseen and how much, especially outside of the dominant culture, of the overculture here in the United States, there's much more space to include forces of the unseen, dreams having a very particular relevance, as well as what we might call illusion, the relationship between the natural and the supernatural, and also I think when you just spoke about, excavating, what are we seeking to excavate? And I'm really, throughout this work, was wanting to excavate humanity, especially for those who continue to be objectified, exoticized, and really to excavate voices of the folks who rarely make it into a story if they're not the main character. How to offer a multiplicity of perspective and voice throughout a series of kind of, I heard someone explain it as kind of these tableaus of the plaza and these performances and who all is present, and that everyone present carries the same amount of importance and power, and how to navigate that as a writer on the page when we're limited, right? So that's the best that I can do to answer that. Maisy, thank you for the question.
Yeah, no, that actually segues into my next question about the unseen, which I noticed kind of in all of your work, and I wanted to ask Linda to read an excerpt before I ask the question.
Sure. So this is from a chapter titled The Improviser's Guide to Untranslatable Words. 1. 缘分, noun. A condition two people are said to have between them if they are brought together in ways large or small for a few minutes or for decades. Lovers, of course, could be explained this way, but more often 缘分 is invoked to explain a stranger who brings a lost wallet to your door and ends up being your cousin's business partner, or an orphan child who grows up to have the same chin as his adopted father. Kasha would say she and Cyrus had 缘分, for example. 缘分 acknowledges some unknowability in the workings of the universe, and implies there's an invisible mesh that loosely bound people and circumstances. It doesn't resort to the heavy-handedness of the English term fate, which is hardly equivalent. No deity of any kind operates any mechanism to deploy 缘分. No looms, no spools, no thunderbolt. It exists more like ambient weather, and like weather, it may come and go and even disappear altogether on a whim. Sometimes people who want to permanently take leave of each other will say that their 缘分 has exhausted itself. But most important of all, 缘分 presents itself in ways beyond human reckoning. To properly explain this, Kasha will have to begin with Junie's birth date, then go back 8 years. That Junie was born on the exact same day as when that young man died 8 years previously could have been a coincidence, and many people would have said so. But Kasha knew that coincidences were merely the long-armed tendrils of 缘分. Knowing what only she knew, the connection between the child's birth and the death of someone who had once meant everything to her, this was as unmistakable as a total solar eclipse.
Thank you. I thought that chapter was so interesting, and the way you structured it, so that the story was structured around different definitions, and I was just wondering, why you decided to structure it that way, and also, what you feel like your book is saying about kind of the way the violence of the past catches up with people, in the present.
Yeah, sure. So I structured this chapter as a set of terms that I felt, when rendered into English, loses some of its complexity. And this is, of course, the ongoing enterprise of translation, which is very deeply tied to the act of immigration itself, that we have to somehow, as immigrants, translate our lives into a different language and into different forms and into different temporalities and relationships, and there's some kind of there's a lot of loss in that process of translation itself. So I wanted to bring that in, and I also wanted to bring in this particular kind of difficulty for this particular character, Kasha, because of her own experiences with trauma, with tragedy in her past, in the sense that when we have trouble translating our past or articulating our past with the right terms, with the right words, we also end up in a bubble, and we become more isolated, and we have trouble moving on to the next step. So I wanted to highlight these difficulties, but also give her a platform, like a launch point to begin the next sort of her own solution to these problems through her own ingenuity and resilience, and see what she can do with that. So.
Yeah, I thought one of the central questions that your book kind of poses is, how many times in life can we start over without losing ourselves? And I think it could kind of apply to all of our work. One of the topics that really resonated with me through reading Momo and Cassia's story was all that gets lost with immigration and migration. The things that families don't talk about, like in your book, with them basically abandoning their child for a time being. So I think, in Jamie's book, in addition to Rufina and Rafa losing their mother, you also discuss the family history and memory lost through Rosalinda's forced kind of migration. And Danielle, you discuss the kind of family connections or ancestral knowledge that was lost when your mother left the reservation and you weren't able to reconnect with your family. So I guess I just wanted to talk a bit about why it's important for you all as individuals and also for writers of color in general to kind of explore this kind of, loss of ancestral knowledge and loss of kind of family ties, particularly through migration, but also as kind of an after effect of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, I was really struck by what Linda was just saying about like the loss that you experience as part of like immigration, and thinking about that question of like, when we think about like successful immigration, what does that look like? And it's assimilation, and that's like where the loss is. It's the like trying to emulate or become like the people in the place that you find yourself. And we don't talk about, so like my mother grew up in Window Rock on the Navajo reservation, and she left when she was in her late teens, early 20s, and moved to Florida, like of all places, Florida with my dad. And we don't talk about that as immigration because we don't think yet about Indigenous nations as sovereign nations, but it is a kind of immigration, and there is that assimilation, and there was for her that erasure. She didn't want to be the person that she was then. She wanted to forge a new identity, and I was the one who felt that loss more acutely than she did, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing, Danielle, your experience within your family, and also Linda, you were talking about the inability to translate or articulate in the right terms, and the implications that can have. I was thinking a lot about how it shows up in the body, right? So somatic memory and epigenetics, and sort of the knowing that we carry with us, but doesn't always verbalize itself. Right. And so when we work with language, then how do we navigate that space and the importance of trying to navigate that space? And I think about being so dedicated to a family's root structure or root system, right? Because knowing that gives true strength for an individual, right? And it kind of is counterculture, again, of the dominant culture and the overculture of coming to the United States and sort of putting on a mask, right? Or leaving things behind, always wanting to leave behind and make anew. And I see that as the lack of a true root structure. And the more that we know about roots and mycelium and trees and the wisdom of root and soil, right? It takes on an even greater significance that are sort of a multidimensional strength and sense of empowerment and connectivity to the unseen and to other generations comes from that connection and relationship with rooting. And so looking at the severing of that, my mother came over as a young girl from Puerto Rico to New York, and very much assimilated, didn't speak Spanish to us and my two older sisters growing up in rural Ohio. And her favorite saying was to just blend, which was nearly impossible to do, and left a real, a deep disorientation point, right? And I know why she said it as a mother. It was for survival. And also I'm grateful to her strength, and I'm also grateful that I get to live a life where, now I can sort of bring in the archiving, right? There's a poet who uses, Bulgania Mort uses archiving silence, right? And that kind of understanding. And so I borrow from that, and also I think there's something that can be a little bit intimidating and awkward also, stepping into a generation of claiming when you look back to aunts and uncles and mothers who stepped away from. And sometimes, you know, I find within myself a struggle to be authentic. And then sometimes I'm like, am I performing an understanding that I have of what it means? Or am I, you know, it's just sort of, when I really sit with it in a deep way, I have to be sincere about when faced with the blanks and how do I fill the blanks. There can be some sense of a little bit of tightrope walking or you know, uncomfortability, and learning to also build relationship with that, right? And in working that in as well.
Yeah.
And I just want to add, you know, Jamie, I love the metaphor of plants and roots that you just used, and I feel that very powerfully too, as I was writing, you know, my stories. That in some ways, part of the immigration process cuts the emigre from this larger definition of family. So in North America, the dominant culture, when we think about family, when we say family, it's usually implied that it's the nuclear family. But when in reality, and across the world, the family unit is large, and it you know, it crosses generations. It goes, you know, it's a it's a root system that's quite extensive, and you know, children can be brought up by 2 sets of grandparents, 3 sets of uncles and aunts. And in that process, you know, that you know, in this the narrative, you know, of who you are is passed on between these intricate networks of an extended family, and I feel that, you know, part of, you know, my job as a storyteller in this case is also to reclaim that larger definition of family, both, you know, across time and also in this sort of, you know, beyond the nuclear family way, and there's a rootedness that can also be lost when we reduce the definition of the family to a nuclear one.
Yeah, and also like touching on, I was working on an essay a couple years ago that's just sort of sitting there waiting for me about soil, and like native soils or soil is very much a living thing. And though most of our cities, right, aren't really soil, it's just like urban fill, or like there's a specific word for it. And there's a distinction between soil and dirt. And when I brought that into a workshop, someone who had known and worked on soil science had said that, I wish I knew who said this now, but that they said that the difference, or when soil becomes dirt, is when you stick a shovel in the ground and you displace it. And that displacement felt like resonated so much with my experience of like moving peoples, and this idea. I was like hesitant to follow that metaphor too far, because, you know, I don't want to say that like once you displace a people, like they cease to be who they were. But I think that's like a fear that's inside myself, that there is that loss, and speaking to that, Jamie, that like discomfort with, or that constant question of like, is this desire to connect to these ideas like authentic, or am I being authentic, or am I performing? I think it's, yeah, feels very familiar.
One thing I thought was really beautiful in your book, Danielle, was the, you know, when you went to the reservation and your family said, you know, this is not your cousin, this is your sister, or, you know, I'm your mother too. And like this idea that could be a way to like kind of mitigate the loss, is to have this other family step in, you know, and be a substitute for the other family members that you lost.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just wanted to switch to talking a little bit about Jamie's book. And I don't think I mentioned it before, but would you mind reading, Jamie, page 172 to 173, like from the break to the end of the first complete paragraph, the last complete paragraph?
Sure. It wasn't long before the explorer was dressing all of them, had them staged in the dining room like an interlocking puzzle. After he dressed them, he told them how to stand. He pushed their arms and legs into place. Rafa would never hold still long enough. Hours they had to pretend they weren't real. It was a kind of rehearsal for what was to come. He had a series he was planning. Instead of his mannequins, something much more compelling. Live models. Something additionally exciting. New names. It will help you forget who you were. Instead, you'll just be who you are right now. He renamed them each weekend, depending on the country and the culture that inspired him. They knew which of them he was instructing based on whom he pointed at. This made the mother relax. There was no past. There was not even yesterday if she was no longer Rosalinda. All trauma momentarily lifted. With the trick of a new name, she could have been anyone. See how easy it is, he asked. Only his name never changed. It was common for Rafa to forget the new name he was given. You'll always be Conejito, Rosalinda told him. Try not to blink so much, the explorer instructed. Try not to do things like cough, sneeze, shift, sigh audibly. The trick is to make people wonder if you're real.
Thanks. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about your decision to, not name people, certain characters, like the explorer is always the explorer, the angel is always the angel. It made it very like almost a little more allegorical, and there are elements of a fable, in it. And I just wanted to hear about why you decided to do that and what effect you wanted the reader to take away from it.
Yeah. Absolutely was in writing in the vein of fable and kind of folk myth, very much where the place is telling the story and speaking directly to the reader. Wanted that kind of complexity and timelessness and wisdom, kind of overseeing the multiple arcs of the novel. And also wanted to not give a name to someone who does all the naming, right? So how to begin to play with what we have known as who holds the power, right? And to also look at naming and who gets to name, who suffers the name of having been named without choice. And then what are the names beneath the names and beneath of those names, right? Especially when we think about place. Very rarely do we know the indigenous territory that we are sitting on, gathering in, and the peoples who are still very much in our midst, who need to be acknowledged, right? So this very subtle way of who gets to be included, who gets to be seen, and when they're not seen or included, seemingly they don't exist or have ceased to exist, right? So I took, in building characters and having great compassion for each character, right, which is essential in good fiction or in good story. That was the one place where I felt like, many different white men of privilege could stand in for the explorer, and I needed to be able to have that experience on the page with him.
Yeah, one thing your book made me think about too was kind of the role of like magic in kind of anti-colonial or anti-imperialist kind of struggles, and that's something I thought about when I was writing my book. Mm-hmm. And I guess you could think of it not necessarily as magic, but also the unseen. But I guess anybody can chime in, just like if that's kind of what you wanted to come across in your decision to kind of include, the magic or the magical realism in there.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to an Anishinaabe friend who speaks about the natural and the supernatural. It's all natural, and that's very much a place that I can understand and relate to. And so again, this way that we have come to learn how to separate, we have come to learn how to fragment and to compartmentalize. And so also some of this work in having a great sense of interconnectivity, relationship, influence. Again, Linda was speaking across continents and across time, is very much reality. For me, that's how I relate to reality as a writer, and also, you know, as a woman of color, as a Boricua. And so there was also the need to sort of push back against who gets to decide what is real and what is not real. So yeah.
Yeah, I think Danielle too, you had the mention of like skinwalkers in your book, you know, and I wanted to know if you could say a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, so my book is creative nonfiction, and like I am, you know, I am an atheist. I am pretty skeptical of a lot of things. Like I think that like my well of belief is pretty shallow, or that I find it hard to engage with. You know, I grew up interpreting my dreams with my grandmother. We had this set of dream books that we would use. And as an adult now, you know, like I can appreciate some of it, but also there was a magical way that she had of thinking. She thought that she was a little bit psychic. She paid to see a psychic. But, you know, going back especially to the reservation, encountering some like superstitions and beliefs that I had a really hard time believing myself, I didn't want to discount them. And so I had to leave a lot of room open, especially in that chapter where I talk about skinwalkers, for other interpretations, because I see it authority in a lot of ways. Like I don't think that my way of thinking about it is necessarily the correct or the right one.
Okay, great. I realize time is running out, so I'm going to switch to a couple of Q&A questions. So the first question is, you each mentioned that you teach at the university level. I was wondering, as teachers, what's something surprising that you've learned from your students? Conversely, what's a lesson you make sure to impart on your students?
I guess I'll start. So I teach mostly cultural history courses at the university, and so one of the things I experimented with this semester was to ask my students to write a kind of a historical fiction piece as their final paper. And what I learned was really interesting, that students who were in my class who were otherwise fairly confident about their ability to do research, to write papers at the university level, were kind of in a panic when I gave that assignment and asked me questions that I didn't think you know, they would ask me. And I sort of found myself thinking about you know, really the switching back and forth between doing, you know, an assignment, doing a research assignment with a paper, and kind of delving into writing historical fiction. And I thought, yeah, if I had to do that, I would be pretty freaked out too. and of course, so it really forced me to think about what, you know, I don't teach creative writing, so I was really trying to, you know, greedily trying to do two things at once, and therefore I was out of my depth. But it was an interesting moment when I thought about, you know, crossing that divide and how to help everyone do that.
The vulnerability of sharing something creative, I think, is something that can intimidate students who aren't used to, or like that's not the thing that they want to do. Yeah, it's hard to handle, or to anticipate sometimes those responses. Yeah.
When I'm teaching creative nonfiction, I'll answer this very quickly because I know there's lots of questions, but we'll start talking about craft, and the students will write in a very particular kind of way. And then I'll start introducing writers, you know, like Therese Marie Myatt and Layli Long Soldier and Natalie Diaz and Toni Jensen, and their voices and their experience and their sense of authority explodes on the page. And that is a direct example of how important it is to have diversity and inclusivity of voices in literature.
Okay. This other question I also wanted to ask. So what was your experience of publishing your debut works in the midst of a global pandemic? What do you feel you might have missed out on when publishing during this time? And were there surprising perks to releasing a book during this time?
I can start with this one. When I first was planning like my book coming out, I'm like, oh, I get to go see all the people I love all over the country. Like I get to go to Boston and like see all my friends that I miss and love in Boston. I'll get to go to like Pittsburgh maybe and like hang out with my sister and my niece. And so I was really looking forward to spending some time, like meeting readers and sharing my work, but also making that space to visit with people that I love. So the perk is I'm actually quite introverted. And so the idea of traveling all those places and meeting all those new people was really overwhelming. And instead I got to sit home with my cats and have like a much more like private release here. So.
Yeah, it's been a little, what's the word everyone likes to use? Surreal. I used to hear that before and be like, come on. And now I'm like, wait, is this happening? I can't tell exactly what's happening, right? I leave the room, I shut the door, and and there's my toddler. And so that's been something that's been really great, is to have been home with my son and with my partner and be able to not be on the road. And also I'm not looking at people's eyes and I have no idea who's out there and how they're really engaging the work.
Well, I echo a lot of these same sentiments, but I guess I'm fortunate in that I really have no expectations of what the publishing process would be, since I have no previous experience. So I figured, okay, well, I'll take it. I totally take it. But so thinking about the silver lining in this, I do feel fortunate. As an introvert who has, been hiding behind my laptop all these years, that even, for an event like this, I don't have to worry about my shoes. I don't have to worry about tripping over things. And I can spend more energy thinking about, what would I like to talk about? How would I share this with readers? And I feel kind of grateful for that, perversely.
Another question, who or what is inspiring you these days? Any authors that you're reading now?
Oh, I just read all of your books. I was like, oh, this is an excuse to read all of these books. But then I also just read Nadia Owuso's Aftershocks. There are a couple of memoirs that I'm trying to catch up on right now. And one of the guiding structures of that book was this metaphor of like earthquakes and fault lines and vibrations. And there's actually quite a bit in that book that I felt resonated with some of the things that we're talking about here this afternoon. But I'm trying to shift gears. I'm trying to write about like video games and science fiction. So I feel like I need to sort of reorient myself.
Yeah, I just read Smoke Hole by Martin Shaw. And it's very much about myth and nature and the intersection of those, and how we can draw real wisdom and direct application from the natural world and from myth. And so he has a lot to say about this very particular moment in time. And so for me, that stories very much are alive and living and want to be in relationship with us. And that book is a great example of that. And of course, I have lots of piles and lists that I'm looking forward to reading also.
Yeah, kind of to go from that too. I've been sort of looking at birds more during the pandemic, and so I I've been thinking about the natural world a little bit more, and kind of just what Jamie was saying. I recently read a wonderful book by a Toronto-based author, Catherine Bush, called Blaze Island, and it's about climate change, told through basically a retelling of the Tempest, and it's a wonderful book, and it really opened up all sorts of possibilities for me, and also thinking about the birds that I look at more regularly due to my the being in the pandemic, and it's making me feel like it's okay to be more ambitious with my next book, and just think about those wonderful avenues for exploration.
Okay, one last question to all three of you. Your books seem to answer important questions about social constructs. Do you actively write your way toward these questions and attempt to answer them, or is it more of an organic process of letting the work go where it wills?
It feels like both.
Mm-hmm.
There's a trusting the story and the characters as they reveal themselves, and there's also a tapping on the shoulder. Because of who I am and where I come from and my history, there are certain things that must be on the page, and these characters must also acknowledge and reconcile.
Yeah, so I think for me, that a question, I think, is always what is driving me when I start writing. I'm sort of like percolating my way through an answer for myself, especially I think in creative nonfiction. And often what I'm thinking about are social constructs. Right now, I'm working on a lot of essays about. I immigrated to Canada a couple of years ago when I married my husband, and so that process was a really strange one. Being someone who, like my mother is Indigenous, but she's Indigenous to a particular place, and that place isn't Canada, and the way that Canada recognizes First Nations, and then what it means to be a visitor in a place, and how we define Indigenous sovereignty and nationhood, and yeah. I think that as I write, I read, and as I read, I ask more questions. And I think that process leads me in unexpected and very fun directions.
I think I tilt more toward the letting the work go where it will. And I tend to, so far, I tend to start with interrogating my characters and asking what they want to tell me. And I usually, I sometimes set up imaginary conversations with them just to see, what's going on. And sometimes they talk back, sometimes they don't. And sometimes they, I enjoy the process in which I could sort of build a little bit of uncertainty into that, in that process, and kind of, have that conversation.
Great. So I think that's our last question. So I'm going to close it out. So thank you all for joining us and having this conversation. And thank everybody in the audience for joining us. The Penn World Voices Festival isn't over, so visit penn.org/festival to hear more about your favorite authors, and have a great day. Thank you.